Hello, I'm Karen Stathoplos, and today I'm going to be reading some chapters from a book I love by Barbara Kingsolver, a wonderful writer. It's Animal Dreams. I've already read this book twice, but not for a long time, so probably time for me to read it again. She's a writer. It takes place in the desert Southwest, two sisters, and their father, who is a doctor, Doc Homer. And she mixes myth, dreams, flashbacks, Native American lore. It's just a wonderful book. And the way the chapters go is that first you hear the eldest daughter speaking, and then her father. And it's mixed up, there's flashbacks, and I'm gonna read you two of the chapters. Here we go with the first, eldest sister. I am the sister who didn't go to war. I can only tell you my side of the story. Hallie is the one who went south with her pickup truck and her crop disease books and her heart dead set on a new world. Who knows why people do what they do? I stood on a battleground once too, but it was 40 years after the fighting was all over. Northern France in 1982, in a field where the farmers' plow blades kept turning up the skeletons of cows. They were the first casualties of the German occupation. In the sudden quiet after the evacuation, the cows had died by the thousands in those pastures. And now the farmers who grew sugar beets in those fields were blessed, they said, by the bones. The soil was rich in calcium. 3 years later, when my sister talked about leaving Tucson to work in the cotton fields around Chinandega, where farmers were getting ambushed while they walked home with dinner on their mind, all I could think of was France. Those long, flat fields of bone-fed green. Somehow, we protect ourselves. It's the nearest I could come to imagining Nicaragua, even though I knew the bones in that ground were not animal bones. She left in August after the last rain of the season. Summer storms in the desert are violent things and clean. They leave you feeling like you've cried. Hallie had never left me before. It was always the other way around, since I'm 3 years older and have to do things first. She would just be catching up when I'd go again, swimming farther out into life because I still hadn't found a rock to stand on. Never because I wanted to leave. Hallie and I were so attached, like keenly mismatched Siamese twins conjoined at the back of the mind. We parted again and again, and still each time it felt like a medical risk, as if we were being liberated at some terrible cost, the price of a shared organ. We never stopped feeling that knife. But she went, and true to the laws of family physics, the equal and opposite reaction, I was soon packed up too and headed northeast on a Greyhound bus. In our divergent ways, I believe we were both headed home. I was bound for Grace, Arizona, where Hallie and I were born and raised and where our father still lived and was said to be losing his mind. It was a Sunday. I had a window seat, and in a Greyhound, you're up high. You pass through the land like some Raja on an elephant looking down at your kingdom, which in this case was a scorched, bristling landscape and the tops of a lot of cars. It wasn't all that different from my usual view of life because I'm tall, like my father and Hallie. I don't look like who I am. They do, but I don't. It was mid-morning when I stepped down off the bus in Grace, and I didn't recognize it. Even in 14 years, it couldn't have changed much, so I knew it was just me. Grace is made of things that erode too slowly to be noticed. Red granite canyon walls, orchards of sturdy old fruit trees past their prime, a shamelessly unpolluted sky. The houses were built in no big hurry back when labor was taken for granted, and now they were in no big hurry to decay. Arthritic mesquite trees grew out of impossible crevices in the cliffs, looking as if they could adapt to life on Mars if need be. I was the only passenger getting off. The short, imperious bus driver opened the baggage door and made a show of dragging out luggage to get to mine, as if I were being difficult. A more accommodating woman, he implied, would be content with whatever bags happened to be right in front. Finally, he slapped my two huge suitcases flat out in the dust. He slammed the doors, reclaimed his throne, causing the bus to bark like a dog, leaving a cloud of exhaust in the air. Getting the last word, I suppose. I dragged my bags to the edge of the street. Carlo, my lover of 10 years, who I seem to have just left, would be sending a trunk from Tucson when he got around to it. I didn't own very much that I cared about. I felt emptied out and singing with echoes, unrecognizable to myself. That particular feeling like your own house on the day you move out. I missed Hallie. Carlo, too, for the lost possibilities. Pay attention to your dreams. When you go on a trip, in your dreams, you will still be home. Then after you've come home, you'll dream of where you were. It's kind of a jet lag of consciousness. Carlo loved Hallie. When he and I moved back to Tucson, the three of us contrived a little household in a bad neighborhood with jade plants on our front steps that kept getting stolen until Hallie thought to bolt down the pots. We played house to beat the band. Hallie and I made prickly pear jelly, boiled and strained and poured blood red into clean glass jars. We'd harvested the fruits from the physical therapy garden of the hospital where Carlo worked. Our home fell apart when she left. She was our center of gravity, the only one of us who saw life as a controllable project. Carlo was an orphan like me. We forgot about the jade plants. They went crisp as potato chips out on the porch, and Carlo withered as if he needed water also. Every man I'd ever loved had loved Hallie best and settled for me. It didn't bother me as much as you might think. I could understand it. I loved her too. And now his life with the Nolian women had run its course. He could go where he pleased. Carlo was a rolling stone and an emergency room doctor, which gave him a kind of freedom, almost unknown to the profession. You can always find work if you're willing to take up with the human body as soon as possible after one of life's traumas has left off with it. Carlo and I met in medical school, and in our years together, he and I probably had more addresses than the Grace, Arizona phone book. Along the way, I'd landed a few presentable jobs, but in between, I tended to drift like a well-meaning visitor to this planet, awaiting instructions. A high school friend, Emelina Domingos, had offered to meet my bus, but I told her, no, don't bother, I'll make my own way. The plan was for me to live with the Domingos guest house, not with my father. My relationship with Doc Homer had always improved with distance, which is to say that mail was okay and short, badly connected phone calls were best. I thought I should still keep some miles between us. Even though he was ill and conceivably dying, it was going to be touchy. He would be an unwilling candidate for rescue, and I was disaster in that department myself. But he had only 2 living relatives, and one of them was behind the wheel of a Toyota pickup truck on the way to Nicaragua. I stood my suitcases side by side and sat on them for a minute to get my bearings. I think I was hoping Emelina might still show up. There wasn't much to Grace's commercial district. The window of the Hollywood dress shop leered from across the street, framing a ferocious display of polyester. The headless mannequins were dressed to the nines with silver vinyl loafers and red nail polish. If I moved a little, I could put my reflection there in the window with them, me in my Levi's and Billy Idol haircut. A friend of mine used to make bizarre collages like that. Nancy Reagan in mink among the slaves on an Egyptian mural. Malibu Barbie driving sled dogs in the Iditarod. She sold those things for good money. The Hollywood shop was flanked by Johnny's Breakfast and the movie theater. Back behind these buildings ran the railroad tracks. On the other side of Johnny's were the State Line Bar and the Baptist Grocery. I tried to place myself inside these stores. I knew I'd been there, directing Hallie through the grocery aisle on a Saturday, ticking off items from Doc Homer's list. But I couldn't see it. Those things didn't seem so much like actual memories as like things I might remember from a book I'd read more than once. I had lied on the bus. I told the woman sitting next to me that I was a Canadian tourist and had never been to Grace. Sometimes I used to do that, tell tales on buses and airplanes. It passes the time, and people love you for it. They'll believe anything if you throw in enough detail. Once, I spent a transatlantic flight telling a somber, attentive man about a medical procedure I'd helped develop in Paris in which human cadavers could be injected with hormones to preserve their organs for transplant. I would be accepting a prestigious medical prize, the name of which I devised on the spot. The man seemed so impressed. He looked like my father. I didn't do it anymore. I was more or less reformed. I could see that Emelina wasn't coming. I hefted up my suitcases and started to walk. Oh, Lord, the terror of beginnings. I dreaded having to see all the people who were going to say, "How long are you home for, honey?" Possibly they would know I'd come for the school year. We would all carry on as if this were the issue, the job, not Doc Homer, who'd lately begun addressing his patients by the names of dead people. Since I really did need to come, I'd gotten myself hired to replace the high school biology teacher who'd recently married and defected. I had practically no teaching qualifications, I should add, and things like that get around. It's tough to break yourself as news to a town that already knows you. Grace had formed its opinions of Hallie and me before we had permanent teeth. People here would remember our unreasonable height in 7th grade and our unfortunate given names. Our father actually named my sister Halimeda, which means thinking of the sea. And my own name, Cosima, means something to the effect of order in the cosmos, which is truly droll given my employment history. Hallie was a more natural abbreviation. From the time she could walk, people never called her anything else. I could imagine Doc Homer dreaming up these names, confident that we'd both take noble courses. Suddenly, I felt dragged down by emotions as I walked along, as if I'd swum out into a calm sea and encountered a bad undertow. I carried my suitcases toward the edge of town. An old, densely planted pecan orchard stretched out from the edge of the courthouse square, and somewhere behind it lay Emelina's place. The reflected sky ran like a vein of silver in the irrigation ditch, but when I left the street and stepped under the canopy of trees, it was dark. If you've never walked through an old orchard, you have to imagine this. It presents you with an optical illusion. You move through what looks like a hodgepodge thicket of trees, but then at intervals, you find yourself at the center of long, maddeningly straight rows of trees, standing like soldiers at attention. There's a graveyard in northern France where all the dead boys from D-Day are buried. The white crosses reach from one horizon to the other. I remember looking it over and thinking it was a forest of graves. But the rows were like this, dizzying, diagonal, perfectly straight. So after all, it wasn't a forest, but an orchard of graves. Nothing to do with nature, unless you counted human nature. A bird's scream rang out from the leaves and echoed up my spine with a shiver that ended in my scalp. I believe it was the first sound I'd heard since the gear grinding of the bus. I stopped to listen. Quiet. Then another bird answered from behind me. It sounded like the throaty, exotic laughter of a foreigner, like a jungle bird. The peacocks. These orchards were full of peacocks, living more or less wild and at the mercy of coyotes, but miraculously surviving in droves. There was a local legend, supposedly true, about how they got here 100 years ago. The 9 blue-eyed Gracela sisters came over from Spain to marry 9 lucky miners in the gold camp, sight unseen. The sisters were just children and only agreed to come if they could bring their birds with them in the hold of the ship. Their legacy in Gracela Canyon was a population of blue-eyed, dark-haired descendants and 1,000 wild peacocks. The branches were ringing with bird calls now, and I could hear kids laughing. A whole chorus of them screamed at once. Toward the end of the far orchard, I could make out children's silhouettes jumping and dancing under the trees. It was dark in there for midday, but I definitely saw kids, little girls in dresses and boys in white shirts. I couldn't make out their game. The tallest boy had a stick and they were chasing something and flailing at it. I walked down the road toward them, towing my bigger suitcase like an anchor. I was traveling light in theory, but I dragged with me into Grace a substantial reference library. I stepped over the irrigation trenches, mindful of my Italian leather loafers. I'm picky about shoes, and there was no replacing these. I smiled, thinking of the awful silver loafers in the Hollywood shop. I envisioned my predecessor at the high school dressed in those, standing in front of a classroom of 15-year-olds, twisting her white chiffon scarf as she explained cell division. What would these kids make of me? My shoes were pointed, and my personal style leaned toward apologetic punk. I'd never had a teacher who looked like me. Probably there was a reason for that. I stopped to massage my aching shoulder. There was something up there at the edge of the orchard, all right, a bunch of kids, something in the trees over their heads. I thought about skirting around the little gang to avoid spoiling their fun, but actually, because I was afraid, I tried to move quietly. Whatever it was they were chasing, they were going to get it. I could see plainly then that it was a heavy-bodied peacock shuffling from side to side on a low branch. Apparently, the creature was too dull-witted or terrorized to escape, or possibly already injured. The children pursued it ferociously, jumping up and down, pulling its long tail feathers, ready to tear it to pieces. The boy with the stick hit hard against the belly, and they all shrieked. He hit it again. I looked away. I'd arrived in Grace at that moment in my life without knowing how to make the kind of choice that was called for here. I'm not the moral guardian in my family. Nobody, not my father, no one had jumped in to help me when I was a child getting whacked by life, and on the meanest level of instinct, I felt I had no favors to return, especially to a bird. It was Hallie's end of my conscience that kept pinching me as I walked. I dropped my bags, walked a little faster, trying to think of some commanding thing to say. "Stop it!" I yelled. My heart was thumping. "You're killing that bird!" The boy froze like a rabbit in headlights. The other kids down on their knees stared too. I'd arrested them in the act of grabbing fistfuls of bright paper and candy that sparkled on the ground. The mute peacock swung over their heads on a wire. When I was 10, I demolished a piñata exactly like this one, with blue paper wings and a long glossy tail of real feathers at a birthday party. After an impossible few seconds, they went back to scrambling for their prize. I felt disoriented and disgraced, a trespasser on family rights. I walked away from the little group of kids back toward the center of the orchard where I must have left my suitcases. I wondered in what dim part of Grace I'd left my childhood. Now here's a short chapter from Doc Homer. The leaves shine like knife blades in the beam of his flashlight. The rain has slowed, but the arroyo is still a fierce river of mud and uprooted trees that won't crest until dawn. He is wet and chilled to his spine. The girls are lost. The sound of the flood makes his blood cold. They wanted to gather prickly pear fruits for jelly. They knew a storm was coming, and they went anyway while he was in his workroom. He follows the narrow animal path between thickets of thorn scrub along the bank, shining his light along the edge of the rising water. Acacias lean into the river with their branches waving wildly in the current like mothers reaching in for lost babies. The girls ignore his cautions because they are willful children who believe nothing can harm them. Hallie is bad, but Cosima is worse. Pretty and stubborn as a wild horse, but without an animal's instinct for self-preservation. And she's the older. She should have some sense. He forces his body through the bank of oleanders near the house and turns back toward the riverbed to search the arroyo to the south. He has no idea which way they would have gone. They roam this desert like pocket mice. And everything in a desert is poisonous or thorned. Good Lord. He has already lost a wife and did not think his heart would live beyond her. Wished It wouldn't. He slashes at the oleanders with a metal flashlight. He'd meant to cut these down when Cosima was born. One well-chewed leaf could bring on cardiac arrest in a child. He'd seen a case years ago, or was it later, after the girls left home. Doc Homer sits up in his bed and stares at the orange pill bottles on the windowsill. There's light at the window. It's a Sunday morning in August. It's only a month ago that he lost that blue girl. His own daughters are grown and living somewhere else, looking after themselves, but his heart is still pumping hard. His circulatory system believes they are still lost. He turns his pillow and rests his head on it carefully because his brain gets jostled and things move around inside his head like olives in a jar of brine. Think about the flood. He is going south on the near side of the arroyo. He stops to look back upstream, and his light finds them by pure luck on the opposite bank. Cosima's thin, waving arms shine like the crisscrossing blades of scissors. They are screaming, but he only sees their mouths stretched open like the mouths of fledgling birds. Absolute expectation. Papa will save us. The road is washed out, and he has to think how else he will get to them. He realizes, stunned, that they have been huddled there for half a day. The road has been washed out for that long. How does he reach them? A boat? No, that wouldn't have been possible. He sits up again. He has no clear image of reaching them, no memory of their arms on his neck. He only hears them crying over the telephone. And then he understands painfully that he wasn't able to go to them. There is no memory because he wasn't there. He had to call Uda Del on the other side of the arroyo. Her husband went down the bank on his mule to find them in a washed-open coyote burrow with 7 pups the girls wanted to save. "There were 7, she'd wailed over the telephone. "I could carry 4, but Hallie could only get 1 in each hand, and we didn't want to leave the other one. He would have gotten drowned." Cosima is sobbing because in the end, after crouching for half a day in the small shelter of that gravel bank, waiting for the mother coyote to come back and save her children, they had to leave them. He hears Hallie shrieking in the background. They're both crying as if they're drowning themselves. When he gets them home, they sit hugging each other on the Davenport, wrapped in the black and red crocheted afghan. They won't stop shaking. They want to know if the baby coyotes died, if animals go to heaven. He has no answers. "We tried to put them in the paper bag we used for the prickle pears, but it fell all apart." The tears stream out until the afghan is wet, and he thinks there will be no more fluid in them to run the blood cells through their veins. He makes them drink orange juice. God, why does a mortal man have children? It is senseless to love anything this much.